Hello, 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 hello out there. I am Poetic Heretic, and tonight will indeed be looking at the birth chart, the astrological natal chart of Edgar Allan Poe. It is now 8:42 p.m. The clock just changed to 8:42 p.m. Eastern Time here on January 20th, 2020, as we begin this stream. Okay, how do we sound? Okay, the audio is working. I will, of course, be giving my interpretation using the various astrological techniques that I have learned and observed to see what his chart has to say. Now, one moment here. I guess I should share this to Twitter real quick, shouldn't I? One moment. It's sure to prove to be interesting, I think. I'm going to read a brief bio of Edgar Allan Poe first to give us all maybe a better idea of who he is in his life. Because while I know a few things about Edgar Allan Poe, I'm by no means an expert on the guy, and so it would also be helpful for me to look at that information first. All right. Looking at the birth chart of Edgar Allan Poe. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. I have his chart on my computer and tablet. I can show it real quick on my tablet, just as a preliminary. This is the chart we will be talking about. Doesn't want to focus for us. There we go. Okay, so I'm not as well prepared for this as I would have liked to be, but that's okay. Let's just figure things out spontaneously here. Edgar Allan Poe biography. Biography.com. Okay. Don't worry, this part won't be long. If you're not interested in this, I'm just going to read maybe a paragraph or two, or maybe three if they're short. Just going to give us some quick background on Poe. Edgar Allan Poe was a writer and critic famous for his dark, mysterious poems and stories, including The Raven, The Black Cat, and The Telltale Heart. I like this already. Who was Edgar Allan Poe? Edgar Allan Poe was an American writer, poet, critic, and editor, best known for evocative short stories and poems that captured the imagination and interest of readers around the world. His imaginative storytelling and tales of mystery and horror gave birth to the modern detective story. Many of Poe's works, including The Telltale Heart and The Fall of the House of Usher, became literary classics. Some aspects of Poe's life, like his literature, is shrouded in mystery, and the lines between fact and fiction have been blurred substantially since his death. Interesting. And then it goes on to say how he was born in Boston and whatnot, which we actually have here in his chart, which we can now transition to. So yes, Edgar Allan Poe was born January 19th, 1809, on a Thursday at 1 a.m. in Boston, Massachusetts. And that is information that I cross-checked with a few different websites, and it does indeed appear to be accurate. Anyone watching who is also an astrologer knows that we always want to have accurate birth time. And I'll just show you that right here real quick. And as you can see, as always, we are using whole sign houses and the tropical zodiac. Okay, so yeah, so his birthday was actually yesterday, which I might have in a parallel universe done a stream on, but in this universe, I only stream on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays typically, and so I just rounded it to the nearest streaming day. So now here we are looking at his chart. So, geez, where to start? Where to start? I'm going to try to describe what I'm seeing here generally, kind of like in the last birth chart interpretation we did for Simony Simons up on my channel right now. And then start going into the basics and then fill in the details from there. So generally here, there is, well, what strikes me is some very powerful points of energy, some very smooth flowing, like watery, like emotional, creative energy, but also some significant points of like intense challenge. He was a very, like when I see a chart like this, I think of someone who almost has his strengths and his weaknesses very clear cut, or has his abilities and his issues very focused, if that makes sense. Of course, I do see that technically there is a bit of a grand cross formed between his ascendant, Chiron, South Node, and Midheaven, which is a little obscure, but for what that's worth, that may have provided a stabilizing factor, but maybe we can get more into that later. Anyway, and speaking of that, like emotional energy, there is indeed a lot of water in his chart, ascendant, North Node, Uranus conjunction in Scorpio, so thus his first house, and a very powerful Venus Moon conjunction, and then not too far away from those, Pluto and Jupiter co-present as well in Pisces. So very powerful indeed, and lots of that water energy. All right, so if it isn't obvious already, he is a Capricorn Sun, Pisces Moon, as I just said, and Scorpio rising. And that makes the ruler of his ascendant Mars in the 12th house. I'm just going to show that there again for a moment. Hopefully it will focus for us. There it goes. So that ruler of his ascendant, Mars, is in many ways going to represent him quite directly, if not most directly. And as you can see, it's Mars in Libra and the 12th house. So 12th house is said by many astrologers to be the most difficult house in the entire zodiac, and for good reason. It's the house of isolation, of mental illness, of enemies, hidden things of all kinds. Um, it's a house where many difficult things tend to manifest. So, so Edgar Allan Poe apparently lived quite the troubled life, and it's not surprising that his like key significator here, or whatever you would call it, I suppose, his ruling planet, the ruler of his ascendant Mars, is in that very difficult 12th house. Let's see, where should we go from here? Interestingly enough, though, it's not aspecting anything, at least not any of the aspects, not any of the major aspects, or any of the ones that I'm using. It's there by itself in the 12th house. Nothing aspecting it, and it's not aspecting anything itself. The ruler of that 12th house Mars is his Venus. Now, this is interesting. Venus, like I said a little bit ago, conjunct his moon in Pisces, the sign of Venus exaltation, and in a night chart. And so it's like, even though the placement of his Mars is fairly negative overall, the ruler of his Mars, Venus, is extremely positive. And as if that wasn't enough positivity for that 5th house Venus, it also has Jupiter co-present in that sign, and it has the ascendant North Node Uranus conjunction in the 1st house, and a powerful trine to it, just energizing it with more like harmonious energy. And so what does this mean? Basically, it means that, so even though that Mars theoretically represented Edgar Allan Poe himself, that Mars in the 12th house, very, very troubled and whatnot, the ruler of that was that extremely positive energy, Venus in the 5th house, and also extremely creative. Venus is about creativity, so is the 5th house. And in the water sign of Pisces, being trined by all that stuff in the water sign of Scorpio, water is emotion and very much also associated with creativity, and thus he became this famous writer. But he wrote about dark things. Well, Mars, the ruler of his ascendant, in the 12th house, a very dark house of all kinds of, sort of horrible things. And I think it's interesting. Well, I'd like to look more into this to get a better idea of things, but the 12th house is the one and only house where we mainly find this idea of mental illness. Physical illness is more the opposite, the 6th house, but the 12th house is mental illness, and someone who is predisposed to writing a lot of sort of horror fiction or whatever, and poetry as well. Maybe someone who is predisposed to an unhealthy mental realm. I would think so anyway. So let's see, what else do we have here? I want to come back to more of that later because it's highly significant, but let us now, speaking of indications of his becoming a writer, a famous horror writer, look at his Capricorn sun in the 3rd house. His sun at 28 of Capricorn is conjunct Mercury at that same degree of 28 of Capricorn. Mercury, the planet of writing and communication, and thus his ego or sense of self, the sun, was very much wrapped up in this idea of communication, Mercury, writing, Mercury. And it's funny because I've seen this conjunction, this Sun-Mercury conjunction, in the charts of people who indeed end up communicating like as their career or like as something that they just really love to do in some way. Like I've seen it in famous talk show hosts, for example, that Sun Mercury conjunction. So they're all about communicating. I believe I've seen it with at least one famous singer, though I can't quite remember who right now. And thus singing, Mercury, the voice, communicating, that sort of thing. And let me just show that on camera right now. Sun Mercury conjunction in the third house. Give it a minute to focus. Come on. Well, I don't know if it's going to focus right now or not, but anyway, it's in the third house, and the third house also deals with this idea of communication. There we go. Now it's focusing. Third house of communication and writing. Short distance travel. I don't know if that's relevant here or not, but for what it's worth. Hey there, Ryan. Wonder if there's tea in the house. I should go make a tea. I love tea. I, however, am drinking coffee on this particular evening. All right, so Sun Mercury conjunction at 20 degrees of Capricorn in the third house. Wait, also, I'm in the same boat as you. I know of Edgar Allan Poe, but I don't really know Edgar Allan Poe. Yeah, I know, right? It's like, obviously, I know who he is. And I've even read a little bit of what he has written, but I don't know like deeply about him. But I guess perhaps if my interpretation of his chart ends up being accurate, which I'm fairly confident that it will, then that will just show that much more the power of astrology. I don't know. Let's see what happens. All right. So Sun Mercury conjunction at 28 of Capricorn. It's at the very end of Capricorn. And if you notice or not, I'll show the chart again here in a bit. But that conjunction is applying to a sextile with Saturn, a supportive sextile with his Saturn at 1 degree of Sagittarius in the second house. And so what is Saturn? And by the way, this is a night chart, so this is difficult for him, but nevertheless, it's a supportive sextile. It's an interesting dynamic. Saturn is the planet of let's make it real. Let's bring something into reality. Let's manifest it. And thus, his sense of self as a writer, as someone who communicates, was made real. Indeed, it was. He became one of the most famous authors of all time, I suppose. And I think part of what makes this aspect so particularly positive is the fact that it's applying, meaning it hasn't perfected just yet. It's on its way to perfecting. In other words, the Sun-Mercury conjunction would perfectly sextile his Saturn once they reached 1 degree of Aquarius, but they weren't quite there yet. They were on their way. Thus, it was applying. Thus, it was happening more and more. Because here's what I'm thinking more and more when it comes to sort of how the energy in astrology actually manifests. I'm thinking, from what I have seen, that it is like a wave, and if you catch it while it's building up, then you have a much greater chance of like riding that wave, if that makes sense. Whereas if you say the aspect was separating, meaning that it had perfected and now it was like on its way out, then like you may see that energy manifest somewhat, but it's going to diminish over time. So it's pretty logical, pretty intuitive when you think of it, when you think about it, logical and intuitive. Anyway, what's also very interesting about this, though, I'm going to show this on screen again because the plot only thickens from here. Come on, focus, please. Okay, so right next to that Saturn, he has his Neptune, the planet of the mysterious and the otherworldly, dreams, the imagination, all kinds of delusions and fantasies, and everywhere from a completely positive to completely negative sense, and everything in between. But notice how the Sun Mercury conjunction is moving closer and closer to an exact supportive sextile with that Neptune as well. You follow what I'm saying here? Or if I can point to it without messing things up. Yeah, my finger right there is pointing to the Saturn and Neptune, and then the Sun Mercury conjunction is on its way to a supportive sextile, not only with that Saturn but also with that Neptune. So that was connecting his writing abilities with Neptune, the imagination, the mysterious, non-physical, metaphysical, spiritual, creative, imaginative realms. And we see, it's funny because I think it was last month I did an interpretation of H.P. Lovecraft's chart, another horror author, famous horror author. And he had some prominent Neptune stuff going on. And so it seems to be a recurring theme in artists of this kind or writers of this kind, to have this otherworldly, Neptunian, dreamy connection to their chart, if that makes sense. And Edgar Allan Poe was no exception. All right, so let's see what else we have here. Looking at the malefics, Mars and Saturn, the ruler of his ascendant, as we mentioned earlier, Mars, is indeed a malefic. Now, fortunately for Edgar Allan Poe, this is a night chart, and so Mars is not quite as negative in a night chart. It can be a little more constructive and positive, perhaps even. So he had that, and then he had of course, the creative energy of Venus ruling that, conjunct his moon in Pisces, sign of Venus exaltation, and all that. But Saturn, on the other hand, would be the most negative planet in his chart. And it's there in the second house. It's not far from his Neptune, which Neptune is also going to sort of reflect and amplify any energy it touches. And so I would expect, from what I'm seeing here, for his life to have been one of extreme limitation when it came to financial matters, when it came to material possessions, when it came to anything that he owned, basically anything that he valued, extreme limitation in that area. And I would also almost expect this to affect his ego or sense of self in a negative way, maybe even his writing abilities in a negative way. But there's a big caveat here, because it is, of course, as I just showed, a supportive sextile from his Sun Mercury conjunction to his Saturn. So even though Saturn is manifesting basically very negatively here, or it's predisposed to at least, there's a more cooperative energy between his sense of self as a writer or a communicator and this very difficult, hard, stern, strict Saturn in his chart. So, I mean, well, perhaps that helps explain why he, on the one hand, became such a successful writer, but on the other hand, led such a troubled life, basically. All right, so let's see what else we have here. Of course, that Sun-Mercury conjunction is applying to a square with his ascendant, or really the ascendant is correction. The ascendant is separating from a square with his Sun Mercury conjunction. So I'm sure that wasn't helping his sense of self any. So we haven't really talked, though, about him as a Scorpio rising. We talked about Mars being the ruler of his ascendant, but not his being a Scorpio rising. So Scorpio rising, in a nutshell, basically means that his outer self was very much aligned with Scorpio energy, which is very intense, deep, dark, secretive, powerful, controlling, extreme, all or nothing, intensely emotional, intensely passionate, prone to extremes, very much so. So that was his outer self, and beneath that, of course, he had his sun in Capricorn energy, and then his moon, I would point out, conjunct Venus in Pisces energy. Now, with this being a night chart, that moon conjunct Venus in Pisces is quite possibly stronger than his Capricorn sun. And I think that's really, very accurate. Very likely because he, as I mentioned earlier, not only has that Venus moon conjunction, but he also has Pluto and Jupiter co-present in Pisces in the 5th house. So let me think how I want to explain all this. I would say, first of all, remember here that Venus is the ruler of the ruler of his ascendant. The Venus in his chart is very powerful, and it's his ruler's ruler, or it's his ascendant's. How do I say this? It's the ruler of his ascendant's ruler. It's the ruler of that Mars. And so, 12th house Mars, he's troubled and all that. But Venus ruling over it in the 5th house in a very positive placement, with the conjunct the moon, and then Jupiter also a benefic co-present. We're talking a lot of blessings from the Piscean realm sort of raining down upon him, troubled as he may be, represented mainly by Mars in the 12th house. But it gets even deeper than that. Deeper indeed, because if he just had Venus, the moon, and Jupiter in Pisces, that would be great. But he has deep, dark, intense Pluto in that sign as well. And so it's like Pluto, I guess he can't win at the end of the day. Pluto is there infusing its dark, rough, traumatic energy into that positivity of Venus and Jupiter, and even the moon when it's exposed to that. And that sort of positive energy infused with dark, rough, disturbing, extreme, sort of traumatic, psychologically problematic Pluto energy, that is all sort of raining down upon him, with the ruler of his ascendant being Mars. It's all raining down upon that Mars that represents him so powerfully in his 12th house. So a very interesting mix. I mean, it's almost like saying that he couldn't have his creativity without some level of insanity, or without some level of deep, dark psychological trauma. We see this also reflected when we look at his Chiron conjunct his IC in his 4th house, 4th whole sign house, I should point out again here. So Chiron, of course, the wounded healer, in the 4th house, suggesting some kind of wounding in childhood, or something having to do with his home and family that wounded him deeply. But in this square to his North Node Uranus conjunction, implying that it was a powerful part of his life purpose in this life, especially as a unique creative being with that Uranus there. Now, also with the ascendant co-present with the North Node in that first house. We saw this in Amy Lee's chart, in fact. This is suggestive, I have heard and observed, of a highly fated life, that Edgar Allan Poe lived a life that was very much based on destiny, like he was probably destined to become the horror writer that he became. And also with Uranus there in the first house, let's not forget that, because anything, of course, in the first house is going to be displayed very prominently in the individual, and in most cases, in the typical case. And Uranus is the planet of sudden, shocking things. It's the weird planet, sudden, shocking developments, great awakenings, but all that is strange and misunderstood, perhaps, but sort of genius, like sort of mad genius. And so that was a big part of the energy that Edgar Allan Poe was personally carrying throughout his life in some way, shape, or form. That volatile, unpredictable, sort of crazy Uranian energy. And of course, that wasn't helped with his 12th house Mars, Mars in the 12th house of mental illness. I don't know if he was mentally ill, but, well, from what I'm seeing here, he might have been. We should also, of course, point out, going back to that Venus-Moon conjunction in his fifth house in Pisces, co-present with Pluto and Jupiter, that when we're dealing with an energy like Pluto in Pisces, especially if there are other indicators of perhaps some kind of insanity or just strange, like, mental activity, upheaval in the mental realm, I would interpret that as a fairly high predisposition, yet again, towards this idea of mental illness. And I think that might have been part of his creativity. However, I would also say that with that kind of intensity, when it comes to the sort of Piscean, Neptunian realm, the idea of drug addiction basically being something that someone with this configuration would be highly predisposed to as well. So again, my knowledge of Edgar Allan Poe is limited, but I don't know if he was a user of drugs or not, but if he was, it wouldn't surprise me one bit looking at his chart. Though I feel like I heard somewhere that he was, but I can't remember. All right, so where should we go next? Oh, don't forget also, when it comes to difficult issues with possibly drugs and or mental illness, that sort of thing, that his very problematic Saturn in Sagittarius in the second house was only 5 degrees, less than 5 degrees really, from his Neptune, which is related or really rules escapism, drug and alcohol addiction, and mental illness and that sort of thing. So Neptune was just sort of absorbing and reflecting that problematic energy of Saturn and adding a Neptunian spin to it. So, oh boy, it's like the perfect storm for madness, but madness that, like, creates someone that is like a genius at the same time, is kind of what I'm seeing here. Or probably more than kind of. I'm actually getting cold. All right. Okay, so his midheaven was in Leo, 10 degrees of Leo. So that's very interesting. Midheaven representing one's calling in life, one's ideal career in life, one's public image, and that sort of thing. And so we have his midheaven in the sign of Leo, a very bold and dramatic sign, and all about sort of being in the spotlight, but ruled over by that sun in his third house conjunct his Mercury. So first of all, this is, of course, connecting his midheaven, his like sort of ideal career / calling in life / public image, with the idea of communicating with writing, both because the sun's in the third house and because it's literally conjunct Mercury, the planet of communication and writing. But let it also be considered, however, that this Sun Mercury conjunction, I didn't mention this yet, I didn't mention this earlier, is in the third house, a cadent house, which means it's in a rather weakened position. It's not in a strong position, and it probably doesn't help that it's a night chart. And so when we're dealing with these cadent houses, these are said to be areas of life that one has to work harder to sort of bring out or bring into focus. Now, let's see. With that Sun Mercury conjunction of his being in the supportive sextile with Saturn, as potentially problematic as it was, well, I would say that that Sun Mercury conjunction had some help from Saturn one way or another. It's safe to say that. We could even look at how that Leo midheaven was trining his Neptune, and also with the wide enough orb, even trining his Saturn. We could certainly say it was trining it by sign. And so there was definitely an energizing of that Saturn and Neptune, which then energized his Sun Mercury conjunctions. So I don't know how else to put this other than to say that it was probably, from what I'm seeing here, at least theoretically, something that he likely had to work towards, this idea of being a writer. Or it was not something that was just handed to him, but at the same time, it's not like he was totally unsupported either. But again, with that difficult Saturn and the Neptune and everything, it's almost like he was supported by his troubles, I guess. It's almost like he was supported by the things that plagued him, his limitations, Saturn limitations. And if he did suffer from like drug addiction and or mental illness or whatever, supported by those things too, like in his writing / communicating. So a very interesting mix. Okay. So let's see where we should go next. Oh, we should also mention, of course, that the ruler of his Sun Mercury conjunction being in Capricorn is, of course, Saturn. And so the Sun Mercury conjunction is literally in a supportive sextile with its ruler. I'm sure that helps things and helped him, like, in a creative, communicative sense, helped him with his writing further, I would say. Okay, let's see what else. With his North Node in Scorpio and his South Node in Taurus, and in the 1st and 7th houses, respectively, there seems to be this indication here that his life purpose, or what he had to work towards in this life, was indeed these Scorpio types of things, the deep, the dark, the passionate, the extreme, the unsettling, unconscious psychological realities of things. And so someone becoming, an author of horror fiction and poetry and whatnot, like he did, it sounds like he basically did fulfill his life purpose, if we look at it that way. Now, that North Node is conjunct as Uranus, and so we have the idea of that purpose also being deeply connected, if I didn't mention this earlier, to his being a Uranian being, someone who's very different, unique, unexpected, weird, very much not what people are accustomed to. I think he also achieved that from what I can see. And then that south node in Taurus, it's interesting hearing the different theories about the nodes. Some will say that like the south node is what we were in past lives. It can also be what we are letting go of, what we are releasing, what we are automatically putting out into the world. Well, Taurus is a very simple sign, you see, whereas Scorpio, the opposite sign, is complex. And so there's almost this implication that he in past lives had already sort of mastered simplicity, that Taurian simplicity of peace and stillness. And in this life he's having to let go of that and build towards the complex, the scorpionic, the also, because it's there in his first house, conjunct his north node, Uranian. And so we do see that interesting dynamic. But if we take the south node to mean also what someone is automatically putting out into the world, then it being in Taurus would suggest that there was a certain still or almost, I don't know if resolute is the word, but a still but perhaps consistent quality of stuff that he would do automatically, if that makes sense. Now, I'm not sure if that ended up influencing his creative work or not. However, I mentioned earlier at the start of this that grand cross between his, technically it's his north node Uranus conjunction to his Chiron IC conjunction to his south node south node. There is a south node descendant conjunction, but whatever. To his south node, to his midheaven, and then back to his north node Uranus conjunction. And implying that all of those things are connected and that there's a stabilizing force because of the nature of the Grand Cross. So first, I'm just going to show this on camera real quick. Let people burn and observe. And then I'll go over it in more detail. The Grand Cross is what forms a literal square in the chart. Okay. So the Grand Cross. Normally, like if we didn't have one of the 4 points of this Grand Cross, then it would be a rather stressful aspect because we're talking squares, we're talking hard aspects, difficult things. But the idea here is that because it's a perfect square, is that there is a stabilization that takes place. Instead of it being a difficult or negative thing, it all sort of counterbalances every part of it because there's, four legs to it or 4 corners or whatever, just like a four-legged table, or like the stability we see in the actual shape of a square geometrically. And so we have these things, I would say, working more or less together. And what are they again? They are his North Node Uranus conjunction, his creative life purpose tied in with being unique, weird, different, but like sort of a mad genius. They are also his Chiron IC conjunction, his probably childhood wounding or some kind of wounding having to do with home and family. They are then connected to His south node in Taurus, the sort of still but steady, perhaps hardworking, consistent release of whatever he automatically did out into the world that required little to no effort. And then last but not least, and this ties it all together and answers our question, his midheaven, his theoretically ideal career, calling in life, public image. And so there is a suggestion here that his you could say, lessons that he mastered in past lives, that Taurian energy of stillness and peace, contributed in some way to his career and or public image. Again, I don't know a lot about the guy, like biographically. I don't know if it was literally his career in his lifetime to be a writer or whatever, but his sense of self certainly, as an author of horror fiction, apparently connected not only to his north node in Scorpio, deep, dark, passionate energy, but also his south node in Taurus, that stillness and simplicity, that automatic stillness and simplicity. So it's very interesting, like a strange uniting of those. When we look at the rulers, it gets even more revealing. Remember, the ruler of his midheaven is the sun, that sun conjunct Mercury, sense of self being connected to being a writer, communicator, whatever. Ruler of the ascendant and the north node, and Uranus, Mars, which we talked about in the 12th house. Ruler of the south node, which he has in Taurus, being Venus, which we talked about being conjunct his moon in Pisces, co-present with Pluto and Jupiter. And of course, Venus and his moon both being very powerful planets in his chart, perhaps definitely two of the most powerful, because we are dealing with a night chart and they're also powerfully aspected. So one way or another, all of these things do seem to be pretty much connected for him, and I feel like that's not always the case with the south node, because there's this connotation with the south node of, oh, it's what we're releasing, what we're letting go. It isn't our life purpose. It's not really connected to our life purpose, at least not directly. It's what we're shedding or letting go. Well, in Edgar Allan Poe's chart, I mean, perhaps I'm misinterpreting it, but it seems like there's a pretty strong implication that south node shedding was connected to his creative life purpose. I mean, it's even in a supportive sextile with that Venus moon conjunction. Literally, its ruler, Venus. I mean, you can't get much more connected than that. So yeah, that's my perspective on it. It seemed like Edgar Allan Poe had a very unusual destiny, I guess, very unusual life purpose. Perhaps a rather alchemical life purpose, where he really had to merge the opposites to find the fulfillment of what he was. All right, so let us further consider some other things here. Remember that sun conjunct Mercury in the third house here. Burn and observe. If the camera would like to focus here, I'll just get closer. Get even closer still. All right, well, whatever. Sun-Mercury conjunction in the third house. It's clear enough to see, even though it's blurry. We know what it is. So, Sun in Capricorn at 2849 of Capricorn, the very end of Capricorn, that means that when we apply the idea of progressions to his chart, I'm not going to get deep into this, but let's just talk about it a little bit. That literally when he was only a little over a year old, his progressed sun would have moved into Aquarius, and his sense of self would have then become more Aquarian-like. When he would have been roughly maybe 10, 11 years old, it would have hit his natal Chiron, healing of wounds. So perhaps some kind of intense wounding event in his childhood occurring around the age of, I would say, roughly 10 or 11. Immediately after that, around probably 11 or 12, it would have been conjunct his IC, putting more emphasis on his family life, home and family life. And then, let's see, hang on. I need to find out something real quick for this. One moment. We're going to turn to our friend Google again. Hey, Google. How long did Edgar Allan Poe live?
Check out these results.
Oh, come on. When did Edgar Allan Poe die?
Edgar Allan Poe died on October 7th, 1849.
Okay, October 7th, 1849. Born January 19th, 1809. So that means he would have been 40, almost 41 when he died. Okay, so, wow, that's a short-ass life. So we can say also with that, now I need to know when he died because I needed to know when the progression stopped, because they can't really continue if he's dead. You know, it's just the reality. So when he would have been about roughly 31, 32, his progressed sun would have moved into Pisces, and some changes would have taken place in that his sense of self would have become more Piscean. So prior to that, basically virtually his entire life, up until age like 31, 32, that progressed sun in Aquarius had his sense of self being more Aquarian, unique, weird, different, unpredictable, completely unpredictable in many instances. All Aquarian people are different from one another because that is the Aquarian nature. And of course, with his having Uranus in his first house, that only amplified that. The modern ruler of Aquarius, which I like the traditional rulers in many cases, but I also use the modern rulers for these things as well. They are applicable enough at the very least. So that part of his life, he would have been much more tending at least to identify with that part of himself, that weird, unique Aquarian energy. Around 31, 32, when his progressed sun entered Pisces, he would have then became more Piscean. Now, the twisted thing here is that it then would have activated his Venus, Moon, Pluto, and Jupiter. And normally I'd say, oh, this is very, very good. But of course, we had, deep, dark Pluto in the mix. So, but I'm sure in many ways this was very good for him. And of course, his sense of self then became more Piscean, more spiritual, sensitive, intuitive, emotional, imaginative, that sort of thing. And definitely touching his creativity. It would be interesting to look at a timeline of his greatest creative works, because I mean, it would seem to me like when his progressed sun moved into Pisces, once he was like 31, 32, that he would have seen some of like his greatest creativity, probably. Now it's also very interesting. So what he was like almost 41 when he died. Well, okay, so let's see here. So that would have been only like a couple of years before his progressed sun would have hit his natal Pluto, the planet of death. So isn't that interesting? And it probably hit that Venus-Moon conjunction natally right before he died. powerfully activating that. It'd be interesting to see what exactly happened to Edgar Allan Poe in like the final maybe couple of years of his life, because I bet whatever it was fairly intense and probably connected to him creatively, emotionally, and probably connected to his life purpose significantly as well, I would guess. All right, let's see what else we have here. Well, let us consider for a moment also, though, this Moon Venus conjunction, because if we're going to consider the moon as more powerful than the sun in his chart, which it quite possibly is because it's a night chart and it's also very powerfully aspected and far more powerfully aspected than even his sun is, then his sense of self would theoretically be wrapped up with Venus stuff as well, but it is, of course, still the moon, so perhaps in a more subtle emotional sense. And of course, what is Venus? Well, it's love, money, and creativity. Well, he was a highly creative being, and let us remember it trined his North Node in Scorpio, life purpose, having to do with the deep and the dark, conjunct his Uranus, being, creative, weird, different, all this stuff. So at this point, we're starting to get repetitive, which is good, actually, because we're establishing what the chart says he was mainly like overall. So let's see. What else can we figure out here? Let's just see. Also, when he was, soon after that progressed sun entered Pisces at 31-32, but this specifically would have perfected roughly around 32-33, if I'm doing the math correctly. That progressed sun would have squared his natal Saturn. And that can be problematic. That can be, especially because that would be literally the only time in his life that he had such an aspect. That could have created great problems, difficulties, limitations for him, especially because he has a night chart, more difficult Saturn. And just like reality probably really hit him hard at that time, though there might have still been the inklings of some blessings perhaps in the future with Venus and Jupiter co-present in natally in Pisces as well for him. Okay, so that's a rather thorough description or overview of Edgar Allan Poe, I do think. Let me see what other meanings we can perhaps tease out here, though. Let's go through his planets and see where everything all ends, because it looks like everything sort of ends at Jupiter in this chart, but let's just see. And you'll see what I mean as I begin here if you don't already know. So going from his first house to his 12th house, looking at the rulers of the planets and ascendant and all that, well, ascendant, North Node, and Uranus are all ruled by Mars, which is ruled by Venus, which is ruled by Jupiter in the same sign. Goes back to Jupiter. Saturn and Neptune ruled by Jupiter. Mercury and the Sun in Capricorn ruled by Saturn, and Sagittarius ruled by Jupiter in Pisces. Chiron and his IC also ruled by Saturn, and Sagittarius ruled by Jupiter in Pisces. Venus, the Moon, Pluto, and Jupiter in Pisces, of course, ruled by Jupiter in Pisces. Descendant and South Node ruled by Venus in Pisces, ruled by Jupiter in Pisces. Midheaven in Leo, ruled by the Sun in Capricorn, ruled by Saturn in Sagittarius, ruled by Jupiter in Pisces. Mars in Libra, ruled by Venus in Pisces, ruled by Jupiter in Pisces. Literally everything in Edgar Allan Poe's chart is traceable back to, or traceable to, a ruler that is Jupiter, that Jupiter in Pisces. And so there you have it. Jupiter is bigger, better, more. It expands everything it touches, its knowledge, belief systems, philosophy. And it's interesting that, of course, it's right there with his Pluto, the deep and the dark, and all of that, and so Jupiter just expanding that part of him, we could say. Let's look at his houses a bit as well. I guess we're kind of wrapping this up here at this point. First house, Scorpio, ruled by Mars, and so we kind of already talked about that, Mars being the ruler of the ascendant. First house, ruled by Mars, having his likely being a fairly theoretically assertive person, but then again, that Mars is in the 12th house of hidden things. It's weakened there. It's also in Libra. Mars doesn't really like being in Libra. So there may have been the assertive side of Edgar Allan Poe may have been rather hidden. It may have been weakened in something that perhaps he had to work to cultivate. Second house, we have Saturn and Neptune there, and it's ruled by Jupiter. So on the one hand, Saturn in a night chart, along with Neptune, would tell us quite a few difficulties when it came to money for him and possessions and stuff like that. But it is still ruled by Jupiter in the 5th house, and so maybe there was some good fortune there as well. It wasn't all bad for him. Like financial matters weren't quite all bad for him. But Saturn was still there. And actually with that Saturn and Neptune being ruled by Jupiter in the 5th house, he might have been predisposed to like gambling or risk-taking in order to try to make more money or gain material possessions, like otherwise gain material possessions, basically. All right. Sun, Mercury conjunction in the 3rd house we talked about. And we talked about how that made his sense of self as a writer likely more something that was weakened and that he had to sort of work to develop, but it certainly looks like he did. That was ruled by Saturn, that house ruled by Saturn, and so more evidence of a sort of limitation or constriction or there's a word I'm looking for. I don't know what it is, but perhaps we could say suppression, being held down of his writing abilities. And so, like restrictions he had to overcome then in order for all of that to work, basically. His 4th house, where he has his Chiron and IC, also ruled by Saturn in the 2nd. And so home and family life being also very restricted, facing limitations, that Saturnian stuff, and probably wounds with that Chiron that he had to work really hard to overcome. Wounds that presented great limitations, perhaps having to do with his money, perhaps also like and or having to do with his like material possessions. All right, let's see. Interesting, of course, that he has all this 5th house energy, indicating the idea of like gambling and risk taking. He has Venus, the Moon, Pluto, and Jupiter all in the 5th house, ruled by, as we mentioned, Jupiter and Pisces. So that was, you see, for all of his issues, that then was probably one of the areas of life that he actually did have very good luck with, but he was still likely traumatized by, because we have Pluto there. Pluto tends to indicate where we are traumatized, especially since his Pluto is pretty powerful. It's pretty prominent. I feel like there's something else I wanted to say about that, though. Well, just nevertheless, Venus is also the most positive planet in his chart, ruled by the other benefic Jupiter. I mean, he experienced gain through creativity and risk-taking, even though he had, there was darkness involved with that, perhaps in more than one way. I mean, that's just as basic as we can say it. But here, I want to see something, because the 5th house is the house of children, Not that every planet there is always going to manifest as a child, but let's just see something real quick. As soon as my freaking phone will cooperate. Hey, Google. Did Edgar Allan Poe have any children?
According to poststories.com, they had 3 children, Henry, Edgar, and Rosalie. Elizabeth Poe died in 1811, when Edgar was 2 years old. She had separated from her husband and had taken her 3 kids with her.
Wow. So, okay, all right. Wait a minute, though. That's literally, I can't believe it took me that long to realize that. Yeah, it appears to be talking about Edgar Allan Poe's parents. No, I want to know about his children. Hang on, let's see if we can find this out real quick, just on here live. Although, oh, that's so weird that it says that, okay, that basically Edgar Allan Poe had 2 siblings, because that's exactly what the third house of siblings would suggest with that Sun-Mercury conjunction. 2 planets in the third house would theoretically suggest 2 siblings. Huh. Well, I guess I shouldn't be surprised. I mean, let's see. It's just, I don't know. Never ceases to amaze me. It never ceases to amaze me how well astrology works. Yeah, I don't know if I can find this or not. Just sort of. Wait, although Edgar Allan Poe had no children, but then it says numerous people are what? Let's find out. What are they? My coffee needs mixed together. Where the hell is it? Please be patient with me, everyone. Edgar Allan Poe. But here we go. Oh, it just says children, none, and then it doesn't give any more information. Weird. Doesn't give any more information anywhere. All right, well, whatever. Because in the search results, it went to indicate it was like although or whatever, something. But so I would say what we likely see with a chart like Edgar Allan Poe's is that since that 5th house stuff did not manifest as children, it instead manifested as his creations. In fact, it might even have been accurate to say, like, if he were alive today and we could ask him, were his like stories and poems and stuff like that like his children? He may very well have said yes, that they were. Anyway, moving on. Ruler of the 6th house is Mars in a night chart in Libra, no aspects to it, but in the 12th house, he probably didn't have the best of health overall, although I've seen worse. 7th house, where he has the South Node and descendant of, well, I mean, of course he would in the 7th house, the descendant, but he has the South Node there as well. Taurus, ruled by Venus. Interesting. Some will say that the South Node brings bad luck and misfortune. I don't know if that's entirely true, however, but if it does, in any case, that would suggest bad relationship experiences or bad luck with relationships or whatever, misfortune with relationships. But he has his 7th house ruled by one of the most positive planets in the chart, that Venus in Pisces. And so even though I'm sure that's not going to mean that like, oh, automatically every relationship in his life was positive, there had to have been, I would say, as an astrologer and from everything I've seen, there had to have been some profoundly positive relationship in his life. And I'd almost want to say, since that ruler of the 7th house of relationships is in the 5th house of creativity, even if that relationship was more like a relationship with what he created, linking it to the fifth house again of creativity. So, any experts on Edgar Allan Poe out there, you can do with that what you will. The eighth house, Gemini, ruled by Mercury. Mercury conjunct his sun in the third house, ruled over by Saturn in the second. So doesn't exactly bode well for any kind of business dealings or his partner's assets or anyone with whom he was in a relationship with, their belongings, their values, their possessions, that sort of thing. Let's see if there's anything else we could say about that. But it's all, well, I mean, but then again, it's so interesting because the eighth house so often gets associated with dark stuff, or back to more of this dark stuff, and like sort of Pluto energy, this idea of Pluto being right at home in the eighth house. And his eighth house being ruled by Mercury, well, his Mercury is conjunct his sun, his sense of self as a writer, basically implying that his sense of self as a writer was tied to that darkness of the eighth house and like death, basically. His sense of self was connected to death, or at least to darkness in theory. His ninth house, Cancer, ruled by the moon, which he has conjunct his Venus in the fifth. So that's an extremely good place. The ninth house of education and higher learning, of foreigners and long distance travel, of spirituality. In theory, he should have had quite good fortune in at least one of those areas or some of those areas. It's also philosophy and belief systems, that sort of thing. Oh, and then, well, for fuck's sakes, I can't believe it took me this long to think of this. Ninth house of publishing. Yes, I think we can say all these years later that Edgar Allan Poe had very good luck when it came to publishing. Indeed. Very good luck indeed. 10th house, Leo, ruled by the sun. That sun conjunct Mercury. So we kind of already talked about this earlier. 10th house of career / one's calling in life / one's public image, saying that his sense of self as a writer was very much connected with his ideal career, calling in life, public image. Pretty basic stuff. 11th house, Virgo, ruled by Mercury. Again, Mercury conjunct his sun, saying that, well, first of all, I would want to point out that because Mercury is in not the best placement, that he might not have had the best relationship with community and friends and people being helpful to him. He might not have exactly been a people person. But it's somehow connecting his sense of self, yet again, as a writer or a communicator, with the community, with friends, with networking, like his social network, that sort of thing. So that's interesting. Though he probably experienced at least some restriction in that area, since the ruler's in a cadent house, and the ruler itself is ruled by Saturn in a night chart. Very restrictive Saturn. And last but certainly not least, his 12th house, Libra, where he has his Mars, ruled by, yet again, Venus in his 5th house, Pisces, conjunct his moon. So 12th house matters of isolation and hidden things, hidden enemies, all of that stuff. The ruler of his ascendant Mars is there, first of all. So let's reiterate that, meaning that basically in theory, and I don't think I even mentioned this earlier, and I should have because it's highly relevant. In theory, Edgar Allan Poe probably spent much of his life in isolation, 12th house stuff. He might have also spent it. There might have also been a theme of like enemies or ostracization, if that's a word, or exile, being apart from the rest of humanity, that sort of thing, very active in his life. But the interesting contrast here is that it is again ruled by that fifth house Venus and the sign of its exaltation, Pisces, and in a night chart, favorable sect, implying that even though this like isolation and or mental illness and or dealing with enemies or hidden things, whatever, was likely a great challenge for him, it simultaneously brought him many creative blessings with that potent Venus in the fifth house. And so again, time and time again in Edgar Allan Poe's chart, we see these indications that somehow his issues were the very fuel for his creativity and his dark creative writing. So that is about it for my analysis of Edgar Allan Poe's chart. However, let me finish my coffee. Let me show you guys something perhaps of interest before we wrap up the stream. One moment. They sold these seemingly everywhere years ago, or in many bookstores I saw it pop up, but I have, I actually have, and I've owned this for many years. Sadly, haven't read much of it though. I always mean to at some point, but of course, my life is so insane. Edgar Allan Poe, Complete Tales and Poems. I do have his complete stuff right here. I don't know, and I thought maybe it'd be cool if we could just read some random excerpts, some seemingly random excerpts from this book, just sort of round out this stream, perhaps, hopefully, a fun way. All right, let's see. I've already said that Mr. Shuttleworthy was one of the most respectable, and undoubtedly he was the most wealthy man in Rattleborough, while old Charlie Goodfellow was upon as intimate terms with him as if he had been his own brother. All right. Let's see. You shall conquer then, mon ami, said she, for the sake of the Eugenie whom you love. This little weakness which you have at last confessed, this weakness more moral than physical, and which, let me assure you, is so unbecoming the nobility of your real nature, so inconsistent with the candor of your usual character, and which, if permitted further control, will assuredly involve you, sooner or later, in some very disagreeable scrape. Wow. Wait, one moment, I have an idea. Let's just see here. Well, since I am Poetic Heretic, and we are completing our analysis of Edgar Allan Poe's astrological chart, I think maybe it's only appropriate that we round it out with a reading of his famous poem, The Raven. Now, this, keep in mind, this is one of the key ways that we learn astrology, is we don't just look at what the chart says, but we take very real, visceral, literal manifestations of what the chart says. And so I want you, as I read this poem and you listen to it, I want you to keep in mind just sort of generally everything I said about his chart, which I think I guess I summed up in the end rather well. Just keep it in mind. All right, here we go. I have read this poem before, but not in years, so hopefully this goes well. Get situated here. Actually, I have no idea how I'm going to do this comfortably. Let's see if I can work something out. Oh dear. I guess this will have to do. The Raven. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of some one gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here for evermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door, darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortals ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token. And the only word there spoken was the whispered word Lenore. This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word Lenore, merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping, something louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see, then, what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but, with mane of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, Perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on that placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, never more. Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore, of never, nevermore. But the raven still beguiling all my sad soul into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then, upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamp light gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining, with the lamplight gloating over, she shall press, nevermore. Then, methought, the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee, respite, respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, O quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent, or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate, yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden if, within the distant Aidenn, it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamp light o'er him, streaming, throws his shadows on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. That's it. Nothing like those Plutonian shores. So I hope that you have all enjoyed this analysis of the chart of Edgar Allan Poe. I'm finally getting to my water here. And so again, actually taking a bit to listen to the poetry from Edgar Allan Poe, the manifestation of that astrological energy that we just observed gives us a much more visceral, like crystallized sense of that astrological energy, and gives us a much better idea of specifically to what the symbols refer. All right, so let us see here. I think that'll be it for tonight. I mean, I could dig out my Pluto and we could look more at his Pluto in his 5th house and try to dive into that, but I think we've gone far enough. I want to thank you all for watching, those who have been here during this stream and those who watch this after the fact. I hope you enjoyed it immensely. I know I certainly did. I am always delightfully fascinated by astrology, and though I may not be like hugely into profound literature like it seems that we have here with Edgar Allan Poe, I am certainly a fan of, shall we say, the dark side of life, and so I appreciated immensely the vibe from Poe, his chart and his poem that we just looked into, that we just read. So thanks again so much. I'll hopefully be back with another stream soon, but I can't say when for sure just yet. I am working on one a special stream, but it's going to take some more time to get that completely ready. In the meantime, I'm not sure if I'll do any more or not, but regardless, I hope to see you all again soon, and just thanks again for being here, and have a great night. Never more.